What makes Crystal Geyser Alpine Spring Water different? We always bottle our Alpine Spring Water less than 1.5 miles from the spring source. And we're also committed to sustainability. That means all our bottles are made with 50% recycled plastic from 2 of our very own recycling plants. So, when you want the best water nature has to offer, the choice is crystal clear. Crystal Geyser Alpine Spring Water, bottled at the spring source. Learn more at crystalgeyserplease.com.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good morning, Rochester Today, Thursday. I'm Andy Brownell, and of course, Tom Ostrom is here. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Andy.
Always great to see you. I guess to get things rolling, as we always do, creatures of habit, what's in the mailbag?
Okay. From Cato. It struck me that jury processes and references that call Donald Trump a felon, I don't believe him to be one. He's got a crooked judge determining these things, but Democrats on juries have to determine these things and be unanimous, and no contrary evidence has been allowed in these cases. It's outrageous. And he's not a felon until every juror on these processes says he is.
Well, according to the law, technically he is until the appellate courts decide his case.
Yeah, another variable. From Jerry, I think FEMA is dragging its feet to slow down the recovery of the hurricane and punish Trump voters, so no one has a place to vote or a place to get into easily with the tragedies in that region. The $750 checks are ridiculous. And then from Wayne, Mayorkas is in charge of the Secret Service and FEMA. Mayorkas and the Biden-Harris administration spent more than $1 billion in FEMA money on illegal immigrants in the last 3.5 years. Members of the U.S. House do not really know this, I don't think. And now FEMA doesn't have the money for hurricane relief. And the media, of course, won't call them out. This is a major scandal.
I'd have to disagree. I think the members of Congress knew full well they approved the appropriations that dedicated those funds for the migrant resettlement programs. That was in addition to FEMA's budget for the hurricane or disaster responses. Whether or not their disaster response has been adequate, I think, is something that certainly could be argued.
I think Wayne is saying, too, that if members of Congress don't know about it, they're not keeping up on things, and the media doesn't help with it either.
Well, that would be a bit outrageous if they were members of Congress and voted for a bill and didn't know what they were voting for.
Right, and Phil, who's an engineer, he's a very well-informed guy on history and politics, and he did some extensive research and several pages of it, and I'm just going to mention a few things from it, what his contentions are. None of these Democrats were accused of trying to overthrow the government when they used the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Example 1, January 6th, Representative Corrine Brown objected to the electoral vote that was in 2001 with the Vice President Al Gore presiding, but the objection has to come up, but it also has to be signed by a member of the Senate. That wasn't done. So Al Gore dismissed the request. And then Phil has this, January 6th, example 2, back in 2017, Representative Jamie Raskin. I have an objection because 10 of the 29 electoral votes cast by Florida voters were cast by electors, not lawfully certified. And then presiding Vice President Joe Biden said, is the objection in writing and signed not only by a member of the House, but by a senator? And Raskin, it's in writing. Is it signed by a senator? No. Well, then the objection can't be entertained. And then the following case shows Trump's VP, Pence, knew about this process but dropped the ball. January 6, 2021, Republican Representative Paul Gosar, Arizona. I, Paul Gosar, rise for myself and 60 colleagues to object to the counting of the electoral votes in Arizona. And Pence said, is the objection in writing as required and signed by a senator? Yes, it is. Republican Senator Tom Cruise, yes, it is. Then the Capitol was breached and it was dropped. And so Phil said Pence knew full well that objection process was appropriate. But after the incidents, then, of course, they dropped it. And then Phil says, who ordered the Capitol doors to be opened on January 6th? Was the timing done to stop that electoral process? And the Arizona Maricopa County audit report showed grounds for investigation because the report listed 15 categories of voter fraud impacting 299,000 voters, and the 2000 Mules documentary showed there were grounds for voter fraud investigation. Trump's VP Pence dropped the ball. And then on January 4th, before the insurrection, Vice President Pence said this, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities, and we will have our day in Congress. It was clear Pence knew about the Electoral Count Act of 1887 and was well aware of it, but the process was interrupted. That's Phil's research, and I certainly am familiar with all the details, but I find it interesting.
I find it interesting as well. It's whether or not the issue is one that plays well with voters, I think would be the question I'd asked. It's continually brought up by members of the media. It's obviously continually brought up by the Harris campaign in direct reference to January 6th. And it's been probably a month or more that I read this opinion piece on this that argued that the whole debate over the vote of 2020 is being largely ignored by voters. And their argument was the polling supports that conclusion. And part of this person, I wish I could remember the author's name. I'm terrible with that, to give them credit for this. They associated the January 6th rioting, the whole election of 2020, and as a national fever associated with the COVID mania. That we are in the midst of a pandemic. Our economy was in upheaval. The entire world was in paralysis. Things got a little weird, to say the very least. Look at the housing markets. There's so many examples of anomalies that occurred during that time that will become, historical asterisks because they occurred in the pandemic. And this author's take on it was that the American electorate would just like to forget about it and pretend it didn't happen because even they recognized that everything was a little out of whack for a few years there. And it's a lot of it's a bad memory for most of us. I mean, we think about being kept in our homes for weeks at a time. We're thinking about toilet paper shortages. We think about kids not going to school. We think about canceled sporting events, graduations from high schools, skipped, the whole works. It was a national nightmare. Yeah. And the obsession of what happened during that election may or may not have much of an impact on this election because of what I just said. I thought it was a really interesting take on it.
Very interesting. The complexity and the distancing from it. Yeah. From Minnesota News, a man who threatened to shoot.
We need to take a break if we're done with the.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I kind of blended mailbag into just us chatting. So we do need to take a break because the clock says so.
Thank you.
I'd be glad to skip the break, but I cannot. We'll be back in a moment with more Rochester Today with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9.
Paul Trombley.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
We're back. Rochester Today, Thursday with Tom Ostrom, Andy Brownell with you. And now, Tom, it's time for some Minnesota news.
Okay. Thanks for disciplining my mind and mouth here. Minnesota News, and this was from Minnesota News. The man who threatened to shoot up a Minneapolis synagogue on September 11 arrested. He'd been seen outside Temple Israel with a firearm. That's a synagogue. And he made violent threats against Temple Israel in the uptown. And the Minneapolis Police Department said the synagogue received a phone call, and this man threatened to shoot up the site. And his Temple's security staff saw a man outside and called the police, but before they got there, he disappeared. Then investigators found out who he was, and they've arrested him, and the Minneapolis PD is providing extra patrols on city synagogues for Jewish holy days. And the police pressure comes among anti-Semitic incidents and attacks in the U.S., and that's just a horrible situation. But the Minneapolis PD seems to be on top of it there.
When the man was arrested, according to the reports I read from the Twin Cities media, he told police that he had nothing against people of the Jewish faith. He was mad at the security guards.
My gosh.
Yeah. But speaking of Twin Cities crime, which despite reports that violent crime is decreasing in our major cities, the evidence to the contrary seems pretty strong. There was a shocking case yesterday, actually occurred on Tuesday. 6 kids, 11, 12, 13, and 14 years old, girls and boys, are accused of going around and robbing a number of people at gunpoint and committing other crimes during a several-hour-long crime spree in Minneapolis. They got all wrapped up. They were in stolen vehicles racing along I-94, the oldest being 14. Both vehicles crashed, one of them being pursued by law enforcement because of erratic driving. They were all injured, I don't believe seriously, and are all now facing felony charges. But what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
I mean, this is obviously, this was a, I don't know, spectacular example of the problem, but there have been repeated arrests and investigations concerning young juveniles committing very serious crimes in the Twin Cities, particularly carjackings and robberies. And the juvenile system in Minnesota is not built to handle this. Right now, there's completely inadequate facilities to detain juveniles. So most often, these youngsters, after committing very serious crimes, are simply sent home.
Wow.
And sometimes they're back at it the very next day.
Wow. Waltz's Twin Cities. Law enforcement officers, whatever their specialty, are always at risk. Here from the KROC News website, a national park ranger was killed during a mission in northern Minnesota. It took place on Lake Capitogama. In my fishing days with friends, we'd go up there and fish. Those lakes are huge and border Canada, and it doesn't take long for winds and rain systems to come sweeping in and cause high seas. And we've been caught a couple times up there on these. So this park ranger was killed. He died when he came to assist boaters in such a storm. And he got the boaters out of their boats into his boat, which is larger and steering wheel and roof and windshield on it, high winds and waves. His boat capsized. The ranger was 55-year-old Kevin Grossheim, a 20-year veteran and a volunteer firefighter in the region. The three civilians got to shore, but something happened to him in the incident, and he drowned, and his body's been recovered. So a sad story, again, of a law enforcement officer on duty.
Just a terrible tragedy.
Yep.
Anyway, you mentioned how big the lakes are. You didn't mention how remote the areas are. The roads are very limited. Most of them are logging trails in a lot of ways. And the nearest emergency responders are miles and miles and miles away from where this accident occurred. So it's so hard to respond to an incident. I imagine it would take a helicopter. And that day it was so windy, I bet you couldn't put a helicopter in the air.
Yeah, different law enforcement agencies responded. The Border Patrol, St. Louis County Sheriff's Office, the Fire Department, Search and Rescue. And that lake is along the Canadian border, and that's way, way up north. And
way up there, yeah.
Yeah. I mentioned the other day on the show that national firefighters associations are endorsing Trump, but there's one that isn't, and that's the Minnesota firefighters. And they endorse Kamala Harris because they say Harris Waltz have been steadfast allies of Minnesota firefighters, and so that's unusual. It's the St. Louis Park Professional Firefighters Association there, and it's significant because unions are split on these candidacies. But so Minnesota firefighters, are, at least that association, is looking at it differently.
I found that interesting too, considering if you look back to the riots in Minneapolis, those brave firefighters for the Minneapolis Fire Department were out there trying to put out these fires that had been set by arsonists, and oftentimes found themselves thwarted by the rioters themselves because Minneapolis police were overwhelmed trying to respond to it until the National Guard was eventually deployed. And they were at great risk in their attempts to respond to emergencies during that rioting.
That's right. They were under attack, as you say. And then one more item in Minnesota news. Representative Ilhahn Omar has a challenger, a lady from the Middle East who was a journalist there, who is now a citizen of our country and lives in Minnesota. Her name is Dalia Al-Akidi, and she slams Omar. She said Omar cannot differentiate between good and evil, and I'm going to challenge her in the election. She said, I'm from the Middle East. I join many Americans that are Lebanese, Syrians, and Iraqis, and Iranians even in Minnesota. And the political issues of that and the anti-Semitism, and she says that Omar has to be challenged, and she wants a ceasefire there, but she's not concerned with Israeli security, and so this challenger is a native of Iraq, a Middle East-based journalist, a citizen of the United States, and she's challenging her in her House seat. And this woman, Al-Akidi, has been outspoken about terrorism and extremism in the Middle East. And right now she's the executive director for the American Center for Counter-Extremism. And she says, we don't like the rhetoric, and not all of us who are Middle Easterners agree with Omar. and she just simply cannot differentiate between good and evil, ally from adversary. She's unfit for office, and I'm going to challenge her. A Republican.
Unfortunately, I don't give her much of a chance. Just considering the demographics of that congressional district, which I don't believe has voted Republican in recent history. Going back decades and decades. It's probably the most liberal area of the entire state of Minnesota. One other Minnesota thing before we go. We mentioned the mounting criticism of Governor Walz's quote-unquote misstatements or his ability to misspoke. Channel 5 up in the Twin Cities, KSTP television, published a piece that called attention to another one of his less than truthful statements, this time during a recent interview on national TV where he touted Minnesota's new family leave laws that allow paid family leave funded through a payroll tax. And the governor stated that the proposal, now law, was promoted by Minnesota business. And Channel 5, Tom Hauser at Channel 5 specifically, quickly called out the governor and pointed out that that simply was not the case. In fact, almost every business lobbying group was lined up against the proposal, particularly the way it was assembled and how it was funded. And then you go, okay, is that a misstatement? How do you classify that? It certainly wasn't a grammatical error, as the governor would often say that he's very commonly makes grammatical mistakes. No, it's certainly interesting, but it really hasn't been widely reported outside that KSTP piece that I read recently.
Oh,
we have to take a break for news already. Gosh, time flying by. Back in a moment after the news break with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell, Rochester Today at News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96
FM.
Good morning and welcome back to Rochester Today, Thursday with T.O. Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell, and this is where we dive into national news. Tom, what's up on your agenda?
Representative and Republican Congresswoman from Florida with the musical name Ana Paulina Luna is calling on the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to respond and to ensure that funds are used solely for disaster recovery now and not for illegal immigrants. And her district on the Florida coast has been impacted by these hurricanes and going to get hard hit by another one now shortly. And she wants to know about the FEMA giving funds to illegal immigrants and therefore not having the funds to address these horrible weather events. And she wants to know how much they've spent since 2021 and answer questions about costs and policies. Because some news reports are saying that Trump, who said about FEMA on the campaign trail, is lying, that FEMA hasn't given money. And FEMA says that. Well, maybe they aren't giving it now to migrants, but they have in the past, and Representative Luna wants to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, my understanding, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but my understanding is FEMA was allocated funding through Congress to take on a new mission of assisting the migrants with resettlement throughout the United States, and was given an appropriation through Congress for that purpose of somewhere in excess of $1 billion. I don't know the exact figure. Those dollars are separate from the dollars that are appropriated for disaster response. So usually in government programs, you can't mix funding. I referred to them previously as silos. So for this migrant relocation program, you can pull money out of this fund. For disaster assistance, you pull money out of this fund. Whether or not there's inadequate funding, I don't know. But I find it ironic that a member of Congress would be asking that, because apparently they're the ones who approved the law. Maybe they voted against it as a minority party at the time when it was passed, because I believe the Republicans were at the time. But I think that that's been pretty well established, that that's the funding mechanism. I do think, though, that the Biden administration and Harris administration can face some pretty strong criticism for their response to Hurricane Helene. And I read an opinion piece that was published by none other than J.D. Vance that was critical of the Biden-Harris campaign's response. And outside of this debate over the funding, which he didn't mention in his column, he did bring up, I thought, some very legitimate criticism about the slow deployment of troops and resources to Appalachia after the storm hit and the flooding occurred and the devastation occurred. And he identified bureaucratic roadblocks that delayed the deployment of significant numbers of military personnel and resources, and argued that the mark of a strong leader would be that they would jump into that fray and clear away the red tape and make sure that those resources got to where they needed to get ASAP, instead of taking 5 days or more than a week to find their way to a part of our own country devastated by a storm. And he pointed out in his, this is J.D. Vance, pointing out in his argument that when the hurricane hit Haiti, we had troops and significant resources on the ground in Haiti within 2 days. In Appalachia, it was more like 5 days. And that does seem a little bit incredulous. When you think of the infrastructure in place in the United States to move machinery and goods, you don't have to go across a body of water to do it.
Yeah.
You have large airports and interstate freeways at your disposal.
I wonder if Vance mentioned, too, the incidents of FEMA authorities trying to block civilian aid to that region.
I don't remember that in his column, but I thought he laid out a pretty good case. Let's put it that way.
Well, he's capable of doing it. Columbia University students on the New York City campus are starting protests again on the anniversary of the October attacks on Israel. Columbia's interim president sent an email announcing new security measures, warning students about the danger of violence, and they'll be held accountable, and the potential for outside groups sparking these things. And some student demonstrators are going to demonstrate off campus, joining other groups whose origins are complex. But again, more on that issue of disgraceful anti-Semitism.
Particularly on the anniversary of the atrocities that occurred in Gaza on October 7th.
And then it's the left and supporters of Democrats that are doing the violence of violence, threatening to kill. And here's one that just came in from an article. The reporter Christina Layla, a 3-time convicted violent criminal, has reportedly over the months threatened to kidnap and kill Judge Cannon, the Florida judge appointed by Trump, kill her and her family. She has given Jack Smith, the prosecutor, trouble blocking some of the outrageous charges he has against Trump. And the Biden administration knew of these threats, and they waited, according to this article, for 4 months to arrest him. And Jack Smith, again, has been harassed by Cannon, and that was one reason that this man said he's hostile. His name is, I usually don't give names of accused people, but he's 65 years old, from Illinois. He's got 6 federal charges. The indictment accuses him of communicating interstate threats and threatening to kidnap, injure, and murder this federal judge. And he's done it before. And the latest threat was July, and after Judge Cannon dismissed Jack Smith's classified documents case against Trump. And so there's violence. But the Biden administration, this article said, waited 4 months after knowing about the threats to charge this man, and he was taken into custody.
On the related note, somewhat, I thought it was interesting a week or so ago when Jack Smith, the prosecutor, amended his indictment against former President Trump that had been dismissed due to the Supreme Court ruling regarding the
immunity
issue. And as far as I can tell, and I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but as far as I can tell, he basically took the original indictment, knocked out a few of the things on the original indictment that probably clearly should have never been in there in the first place, and reworded the indictment because it's the same allegations. The allegations haven't changed. All he did was insert language that argues that Trump committed these infractions as a private citizen rather than while fulfilling his duties as president of the United States, without offering any supporting evidence to any additional supporting evidence, I better say, to make that argument. So I just wonder if this thing will just go back and have to be thrown out again.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
Well, it'd be activated after the election. And then, as you say, these things are going to end up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they likely have to.
Yeah.
And, you have anything else before we take the break?
That's it.
Okay. I did see some pretty interesting polling numbers. Article in the Wall Street Journal that for the first time in 30 years, a number of national polls are showing more Americans identifying as Republicans than identifying as Democrats heading into this election. And in some cases, I think in the third quarter preceding the election is the first time it's happened since the 80s, I believe. And it's not a decisive advantage. It's like, 42 to 40%, 2 to 3 percentage points, depending on which polling outfit you looked at. But it is a significant sign of a political shift in this country and a significant indicator of displeasure with the current administration that not that long ago, I believe it was sometime earlier this year, the Democrats had a 6 percentage point lead in the same type of polling over Republicans. Now, whether that translates into action at the ballot box is completely unknown at this point. It's not a true indicator of what will happen because at the same time, the Republicans have an edge in this general question. Many of the polls show Harris has a slight lead over Trump, and others show it as a dead heat as we head into mid-October almost ahead of the election. And the big question will be among those independents, will those independents who say they are now leaning Republican act and vote for Trump or cast a ballot for Trump rather than not vote at all or vote for Harris? And then you have this certain percentage of people identifying as Republicans who say they're going to vote for Harris because they don't like Trump. And the question will be, will any of them switch over and not actually vote for Harris, not vote at all, or vote for Trump? So there's almost an infinite number of variables in there that could make this polling meaningless, but it's still significant that I think it is a marker of displeasure over what is happening in the country right now with the current administration.
And I've read that Jewish Democrats are shifting to the Republican Party, too, after all this anti-Semitism and threats against them.
Okay, we'll take our break, return with some more of Rochester Today on Thursday with Tom Ostrom, Andy Brownell on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
We're back with Rochester Today. Tom and Andy, Thursday. Tom, let's start with some international news.
Well, the Biden administration keeps poking the China bear, and Biden approved $567 million in defense for the support of the Republic of China. That's the island of Formosa, that's Taiwan. And China, of course, is vehement about claiming that it controls the political region and has most nations not recognizing Taiwan. The White House doesn't either, but it aids Taiwan with, they say American troops are there training, and it's got, China says you got to stop selling weapons to Taiwan, but the United States is doing it, and services and other things to help Taiwan defend itself, while China seems to be imposing its Navy and Air Force in a ring around Taiwan, threatening it and threatening its territorial waters.
And threatening the territorial waters of other countries in that area, other islands. But that defense support for Taiwan has been longstanding U.S. policy. There's another piece I read as China and Xi continue to, I guess, transmit or broadcast military might in a farther, a greater geographic area and worldwide. Their economy at home is not doing well at all. There are signs of great cracks within their economy, and their stock market tanked earlier in the week, lost 10% or more of its value after having a run-up a bit because of some statements made by the Politburo, or whatever they call it over in China, the Communist Command, that they were going to take steps to try to bolster the economy. But apparently the investors did not believe they would do it, or that their interventions would be successful, and produce quite a sell-off in their stock market. And a lot of this is tied to the housing market, where they have millions and millions of empty housing units that will continue to be empty because their population is now on a decline. And the debt burden from that real estate fiasco, which was promoted through government policy, is really beginning to impact their economic outlook. And if there's a significant economic crisis in China, the communists in charge may not be all that popular for very long.
And if Trump's reelected, it's more tariffs against China, so that won't help their economy. That's why they don't want him reelected. Alaska, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Air Force have a perimeter zone. In international law, Russian fighters and ships can come close to Alaska, staying in international waters. Then there's a zone closer to Alaska that is not to be transgressed. And then there's the Alaskan sovereignty zone, which should never be transgressed. And 2 Russian fighter jets went into those questionable zones. And when U.S. Air Force responded, one of the jets flew right in front of right angles to one of the U.S. Air Force planes. And it was a very close call. So if something had happened there, that'd be an international incident. And the French president, Macron, he is criticizing Israeli defense actions, thinks there should be a peace negotiation. And after Israel's been attacked, and the French are criticizing Israel for defending itself in Gaza and for eliminating enemy terrorist leaders. And Netanyahu is furious about that, and he said if Macron Shame on him. We're paying no attention.
Yeah, it's exactly who are you going to have peace negotiations with? That would be the question I would have. The leadership of Hamas has been taken over by a man who's considered to be the most extreme of the extremists. He is a man who promotes suicide bombings. And in fact, they did have that attempted suicide bombing in Tel Aviv not that long ago. And within Hamas, there's been a split between those who are, quote unquote, militants who wanted to maintain some semblance of a respectable diplomatic corps, and this individual who is considered by some to be a megalomaniac, a madman, and he apparently has taken over reins of Hamas amid the ongoing Gaza war, and apparently has no interest at all in discussing any sort of peace with Israel. So it begs the question, who are you supposed to be talking to?
Yeah, and Macron's talking to them and not directly with the Israelis. And the ex-Israeli Prime Minister, Bennett, says the world has to help us deal with Iran. It's a savage regime. It's killed many Americans, and we're fighting this war on behalf of the free world. And we need the free world to help us on this Iran nuclear threat. And a reporter asked if he thought Netanyahu would strike Iran's nuclear sites because they're going to retaliate sometime against Iran's attacks. And the former prime minister said in answer to, will he strike nuclear sites? I don't know. I hope so.
There was a headline I saw recently, again, Wall Street Journal, that the Biden administration is irritated or angry with Netanyahu and the Israeli government because they're not really sharing their plans for whatever retaliation they have in mind over the recent missile barrage that they faced from the Iranians. And I kept thinking, well, I wouldn't share those plans either.
No.
Being the situation that Israel's in, I don't, and the way the Biden administration has, I guess, in some ways, spoken out of both sides of their mouths on this issue, I wouldn't go there either.
No.
Okay. I guess we have to go. Time says so. I guess we'll talk to you on Tuesday of next week, Tom. You have a great weekend.
You too.
All right. Tomorrow, Steve Lang will join us from Rochester Magazine. Very interesting story about a southeastern Minnesota man who 50 years ago did something pretty amazing. We'll talk about that tomorrow, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday, Tom. It's Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.